The recent terror attacks in Paris and San Bernardino, California, have sparked anti-Muslim rhetoric and put the heat on Muslim Americans to do more to counter extremist violence. We will talk with a prominent Muslim commentator about recent events, about the effect these events have had on Muslim communities, and we will talk about what it means to be a Muslim in America today. And we will welcome your thoughts and questions. I'm Joy Cardin. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. Our guest is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, An American Muslim Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. And we will welcome your questions for him at 1-800-642-1234 or send an email to talk@wpr.org. You can also post on the Joy Cardin Show Facebook page or tweet us at Joy Cardin Show. Zuhdi Jasser is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He serves as vice chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. And Dr. Jasser is also a physician currently in private practice in Phoenix, Arizona, specializing in internal medicine and nuclear cardiology. And he is also the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, An American Muslim's Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. Good morning.
Good morning. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much for being with us. We talked to you in the past a couple of times. You also have a connection with Wisconsin. Did you used to live in Neenah?
Yeah, I grew up. I'm a Wisconsin boy. My parents moved to Wisconsin when I was 4. My dad practiced medicine in Appleton, Neenah, Menasha. I grew up in Neenah, Menasha. Went to junior high school, graduated from Neenah High, went to undergrad, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and I was on a Navy scholarship at the Medical College of Wisconsin in Wauwatosa. Graduated in 92.
Yeah, well, welcome back to Wisconsin via the radio.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be back with you. I always consider Wisconsin my home state. I live in Phoenix now.
So we there's so much to talk about, but top of mind right now is the Republican candidate debate last night, where we heard a lot of things, including Donald Trump defending his proposal to temporarily ban all Muslims from entering the United States. He said, "We are not talking about religion, we're talking about security." What's your response to that?
Yeah, I think, ultimately there's just too much noise going on in these debates between two sides that are sort of leaving a large vacuum in the middle. And I think both of them are looking at Islam in a monolithic way. And unfortunately, what presidential candidates don't seem to realize, they are looking at things as if it's only related to an election cycle. And candidates like Mr. Trump sort of just say what they think people want to hear in a demagogic fashion. And unfortunately, don't look at the strategic importance of things that they say. So ultimately, I think the old Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama narrative has been that Islam is monolithic, taking the lead from Saudi Arabia, Iran, and other theocracies and saying, well, we don't want to offend Islam. Islam is peaceful. And that monolithic approach sort of marginalizes reformers, marginalizes those who really want to bring Islam into the 21st century. Also, the Trump approach is also monolithic, saying that Islam is the problem and that Muslims are the problem, and unfortunately both are conflating what I call political Islam or large movements of Islamists with Muslims. And if we can't thread that needle in this national conversation and separate the political movement of Islamism, be it the Shia version of Khomeinism or the Sunni version of the Muslim Brotherhood or Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, that really is the root cause of radicalization, and say that Muslims are our greatest assets, our greatest allies, unfortunately, we are going to not only miss the mark, we're going to alienate the very people that we need to bring on board in this battle. And I tell you, as a Muslim that loves America, I see this battle no different than our founding fathers that fought against theocracy, and nobody said they didn't love their faith, but ultimately they were pushing back against Christians who were theocrats, and they weren't priests, they weren't theologians per se, but yet they knew enough about their faith to be able to push back. And I think our politicians and their platforms need to be able to make that distinction, and Trump wasn't able to. Carson, when he made the comments about Muslims who couldn't be president, I think he was talking about Islamists. certainly, but we need to have leaders that can make these distinctions.
Yeah. Well, so are Trump's critics correct then when they say his talk is dangerous, that it's helping ISIS, not hurting ISIS?
The way you put it there, yeah, I think so. I think it goes a bit too far to say that they're bigoted. We don't know what's in his heart. But the bottom line is they're dangerous because the ISIS narrative, the reason ISIS attacks soft targets and does this asynchronous warfare is the biggest threat, the biggest existential threat to their existence is liberty and Muslims that believe in freedom, that reject the theocrats. The Saudi Arabias of the world, the Irans of the world are not a threat to ISIS because that's basically what they are. The only difference is the Saudis do it from a corporate perspective while ISIS does it from a grassroots sort of viral perspective, but it's the same Islamist ideology. While the threat to them, that's why the greatest traffic in the internet of ISIS ideology is in America, Tunisia, and in areas where there's freedom and in areas where they see Muslims that reject them as being the biggest threats to them pushing their messages out. So if we're going to enable Muslims to be the solution, this can't be fixed from outside the House of Islam. So the individuals applying to be commander-in-chief, and this is what I was really saddened by the debate last night, is I didn't get any sense of the vision or the doctrine that any of these candidates would see the lens through which they look at the Middle East. And to detach their commentary about Muslims from how 56 countries that are Muslim majorities would then feel that American foreign policy will be applied to them, let alone domestic policy for our national security, is really very narrow-minded and doesn't show a vision and is too short-sighted for those who'd be running for president.
Yeah. I'm also curious to your thoughts since Donald Trump made his remarks about banning Muslims from entering the United States, that he has continued to grow in the polls. The one showing him now with 41% of the vote over his closest rival, Ted Cruz, with 14%. The fact that this apparently means that the GOP voters are agreeing with him.
Well, what's happening is there's a vacuum between two polarities happening, which is, and this is what I told Congress when I testified in 2011 on radicalization, and I said, the Muslim issue, because we're only 3 to 4 million people in America, is being torn between two extremes, and it's leaving a large vacuum in which there's no adults in the room to really educate Americans. And, there's been a hunger in America for hearing a moderate voice, not just a voice that condemns the act of terror, but a voice that owns up and takes responsibility for the ideas that are fueling, sort of before the radicals put on their military vests and weapons and go to kill somebody, there is a time in which they're wearing the jersey of the Islamic State, and there's a sentiment in which they hate America, etc. What are Muslims doing to fix that? So that hunger for hearing the Muslim voices of reform is turning into starvation and is turning into anger. And that anger is going to be filled with dysfunction, with a sense of, let's put a wall around America, let's not bring in any... All these things that are in many ways un-American is a populist response to a lack of leadership and a lack of education. And, I was critical of both President Bush and Obama as far as not threading that needle and educating America that there are theocrats within the House of Islam, and then there are those who are trying, to bring about revolution for democracy. And unfortunately, the lack of leadership has left the populist response to be one in which it becomes ethnocentric and it becomes blind to any type of strategy in the long term. And I think the voters will turn around. Just as, when Reagan was fighting the Cold War, initially he called them the evil empire. Americans responded that this is too harsh, etc. And slowly he educated them about the value of calling a spade and started to identify prisoners of conscience like Natan Sharansky and others that he daily reminded Americans about, and slowly shifted the public sentiment about how to approach the ideology that we fight in the Cold War. And we ultimately never had to fire a bullet directly against the Soviets. So I think similarly we need leaders that don't just demagogue what a fearful population want to hear, but rather lead through education.
I'm Joy Cardin talking with Zuhdi Jasser, who is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. 1-800-642-1234 or send an email to talk@wpr.org. Zuhdi, why do you feel you need to save your faith? What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, there are many of us that say that, listen, this is the denial that it's just sort of these acts that happen are part of a psychiatric problem or a criminal problem related to people that just go haywire. It's much deeper. Saudi Arabia's government has beheaded more people in the last 6 months than ISIS did. The Iranians imprison anyone who fights against their theocracy. So across Muslim-majority countries, we have not gone through what the West went through in the 18th and from the 15th to the 18th century. There was where there was reform, there was a separation of church and state. So we formed the American Islamic Forum for Democracy not to fight terror, but to fight for the separation of mosque and state. And just last week we launched a bipartisan, broad-based coalition called the Muslim Reform Movement. And we said, listen, we're not going to do the hard work initially of the theological reform of modernizing the oral tradition of Sharia, Islamic law, and other things that are still stuck in the 13th century. But we will set the goalposts, and the goalposts we set are a 2-page declaration that said we reject any Islamic state, not only the Islamic State. We reject violent jihad. We reject apostasy and blasphemy laws that suppress free speech. And we accept the equality of men and women. We believe that Muslims don't have an exclusive right to heaven. We basically said that we believe in the separation of mosque and state, and all these principles can be the ultimate goal to get Islam to that. And anyone who believes that those principles are currently the prevailing thought of our leadership, of imams and other clerics, even in this country, we believe as reformers that that's just denial. It's just not true. I mean, if you pull their legal texts from the mosques, as much as they live peacefully here and are not anarchists, are not violent, to believe that our legal texts and the mantras of teachings of Islam, even for those in America, has become commensurate with Western modernity and secularism is I think, denial. And really that's why we haven't gotten anywhere in fighting radicalization.
We will talk about the uptick in anti-Muslim rhetoric and action, and the continued call that Muslim Americans need to do more to counter extremist violence when we return. And we'll welcome more of your questions for our guest, Zuhdi Jasser, who is founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam. He serves as vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. 1-800-642-1234 or send an email to talk@wpr.org. This is the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. I'm Joy Cardin. We are talking about what it means to be Muslim in America and talking about what anti-Muslim rhetoric and actions, what effect these events have had on Muslim communities. And we are welcoming your questions for our guest, Zuhdi Jasser, who is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim's patriot's fight to save his faith. 1-800-642-1234 or send an email to talk@wpr.org. You can also post on the Joy Cardin Show Facebook page or tweet us at Joy Cardin Show. Zuhdi Jasser grew up in Appleton and the Fox Valley in Neenah, Menasha, where his family built the first mosque. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But I wanted to ask you, Zuhdi, how do you respond when you hear people criticizing Muslims and you hear President Obama calling on Muslims for doing more to condemn terrorist attacks and threats against America?
Well, I think, ultimately, and let me also preface, I sit on that Commission on Religious Freedom, and these ideas are my own. I don't want people to feel that I speak for that commission, but I'm proud to serve on that. I do think it's important that Americans realize that, we as Muslims need, I would call it tough love. And it's important that you look at both of those terms, the tough part and the love. Without the love, you can't get reform. So if we start generalizing and sort of sweeping with a broad brush all Muslims, you're going to basically prevent the enabling. And that's why I think American Muslims have a unique responsibility. For those of us who grew up in towns like Neenah and were able to have the freedom to build a mosque, I mean, there was controversy. Our mosque was built in 1979, right after the hostage crisis there in Neenah. And there was pushback at the time, and my parents went to the media and educated Americans about what Islam is and that it's not what Iran is. And ultimately, while there were some voices that tried to stop it, 99.9% of Wisconsinians there encouraged us and embraced us. And that freedom we need to give back to our communities and say, we have an obligation to, there's an Arab awakening that happened in 2011 where you have huge changes happening across the Middle East. It saddened me that yesterday I didn't hear any discussion about that in the debates, because American Muslims can play a significant role in that. But the tough love part is, if we don't understand that Muslims are going through and are part of that fabric of American immigrant ideology, that our first freedom in America, which is religious liberty, is also a liberty that Muslims can embrace, we not only change who we are, and it's surrender. It's surrender to ISIS, surrender to the Saudi narrative, the Iranian narrative, the Muslim Brotherhood narrative, and will also imperil national security, because you then allow the ISIS narrative that it's the West, Christendom versus Islam, or non-Muslims versus Islam, versus actually a battle within the house of Islam. So I think ultimately, once we embrace Muslims, we then have to give them a tough love and say, listen, the victim narrative, the grievance narrative, we have to tamp down bigotry against Muslims, but these concepts of Islamophobia need to stop. In our declaration, our Muslim Reform Movement, we have at the top of our website, and it's in there, it says, ideas do not have rights, human beings do. Muslims like myself are in prison and get flogged in front of mosques in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere because they're told that they've left Islam because they're critical of things that the clerics that are empowered by the government say. So what happens is, in America, certain grievance groups that speak on behalf of our community have created blasphemy laws by not allowing Americans the freedom to have this conversation about what is and what is not Islam. So we have to not, if you're going to empower reformers, we have to have an environment where people can say things that, just as they do about Christianity, there's artwork that's done that is very offensive. And for Muslims to mature, we have to treat us like adults, not like children where we get special rights, versus other faiths that are criticized all the time in public media.
Let me go to Patrick in Beloit. Hi, Patrick.
Hello. I wanted to thank your guests for being on today. Keep on going. I think education is what is going to bring this country around. I think we're in a very scary time. Looking at the debate and what points are being brought up and how readily they're being welcomed is an indicator of where we are as a country. I think, with Christianity, people have that base knowledge of what it is. So when we have people, fundamentalist Christians, that have strikes at abortion clinics, different things that would be called an act of terrorism are being called, this is an extremist group of Christians, because people have that base knowledge of, okay, this Christianity is not really about that. Whereas we don't have that big base of what Muslims are. What is the Muslim religion? The majority of Americans don't know. It's just, it's a black or white issue. And I think it's pretty scary. How are you going to educate the mass? I mean, it seems like such a big, hard struggle to do. I mean, I guess, is there a way of having a Disney movie about it? I mean, it sounds pretty ridiculous, but it's something of that nature to get it out that, there's a beautiful part of this religion, that it's more than just, this black or white issue.
Yeah, so not all Muslims are terrorists, Zudi Jasser. How do we educate more people along those lines?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to create forums, panels, debates where Americans can see that the Muslim community is not monolithic. Allow us to have a compare and contrast, and that the issue terrorism is an act. It's a simple endpoint of militancy. That's not the problem. Before they become militant, there's years of radicalization in which they're not donning the military equipment, but they're still sort of becoming separatist in their ideas. So I'd be careful in, every type of violence has its origin, be it drug-related violence, be it psychiatric violence related to illness. I'd be careful with the moral equivalency, because violence related to radical Islam is the tip of the iceberg of a global problem that's coming out of huge movements that include hundreds of millions, with millions in Egypt and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Syria. We see a civil war between elements of fascisms, and these things, the violence that we see from ISIS is related to that. So I think ultimately education can happen by not saying that we're going to have a discussion between a non-Muslim and a Muslim, because it looks like Islam is being attacked. And I think we need to lift up beyond what I call the bigotry of low expectations, which is we say, well, Muslims, let's not discuss or debate the way they treat women, or the way they, the clerics who say that a woman gets a half a vote of a man in a court, or gets a quarter of the inheritance. These are things that are still supposedly in our scriptures. Now, some of us reject that, but I think we need to go beyond the fear of addressing core issues that I think are the first few stages in radicalization.
Yeah. So we mentioned that you're a physician in private practice in Phoenix. Are things different since San Bernardino for you? Are you sensing fear from patients or community members because you are a Muslim?
That's a great question. I do think there's been a shift in that. Before, the targets used to be targets that were iconic, whether it was the World Trade Center or Fort Hood, National Guard centers, Ottawa Parliament. This was just a random act that penetrated deep into the, what asynchronous warfare is all about, which is to make a population fearful. And everybody here in the community knows my work, and I do it. And as tough as I am, sometimes I'm my own co-religionist, I do it because I fear for my kids, my grandkids, and will our understanding and our leadership of our faith teach our children a theology that's compatible with Westernism, with the equality of men and women, and with principles that are enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And I think ultimately there is fear. The conversation is so polarized. And I'm so glad for the opportunity to be able to talk to you about this, is that we need more Muslim voices of reform. And I think that'll begin to ebb the fear. Greater than 60% of Americans now are fearful of Islam. After 9/11 in 2002, it was 34%. And this is growing because there's been a paucity, a lack of a frank conversation about root causes. And ultimately, Americans are hungry to hear this conversation. And many of my patients tell me they thank me for my work. They know why I do it. And sometimes it can be pretty dangerous speaking out publicly against ISIS and against radical Islam, where you have governments like the Saudis that don't like what we say, or like the Iranians. But at the end of the day, it pales in comparison to the risk that my family, my cousins and aunts and uncles in Syria have as they dodge bombs. One of my aunts was a few miles from a couple chemical attacks from the Assad regime. So, after the Arab awakening and since the revolution in Syria, that as we talk to our family in Aleppo and Damascus, the dangers we have just pale in comparison to what they have to live through.
Let's go to Errol in Madison next. Hello, Errol.
I just want to comment earlier. I heard he was saying these people aren't criminals, it's Islam. I have to completely disagree with that. In this tough love thing, every Friday I go to our mosque, they never talk. We don't hurting one person, one innocent person. I mean, religion is peaceful and it's compatible. I'm able to practice my faith in this country. The Constitution allows it, unless I go outside of the laws that they've made, which they're both compatible. I'm able to practice my religion in this apologetic attitude that we have to apologize for these people. They've gone outside the law. They've gone outside everything and done horrible acts that has nothing to do with the religion, and it really bothers me to apologize for these people, because people want to imply that the religion has fault. They're trying to do that, and they cannot. It's like oil and water mixing. They just don't mix the two.
Yeah, so why should Errol have to apologize for the actions of extremists, I think is what he's saying, Zudi?
That is a great question, and thank you so much for calling. This is a conversation we need to have in the Muslim community. You know what? Our organization has never released a press release condemning an act of terror. We never felt we needed to, because you're right. The act itself is so heinous. I mean, I as a physician, you as a human being, all of us, nobody needs to condemn that kind of heinous act. But what we need to do, and the reason I've never been asked to condemn it, is people know where we stand on fighting root causes. So I think we need to look as Muslims deep within our soul and say, listen, if we look at this like a meth addiction, the meth addict that gets in a car and kills people or grabs a gun and starts shooting, what is the gateway drug? What is the first stages of radicalization? So if we have mosques in which women aren't on the board, in which women are relegated to the back of the mosque, is that process of discrimination a part of the process that begins the separatism, in which the imam may say Americans are killing Muslims in Iraq, the imam may say that Americans are, foreign policy is a Zionist conspiracy, and all these other ideas that penetrate the consciousness of Muslims. They may not be, you're right, they're not advocating terrorism, they're not advocating violence, but the gateway drug, we need, in medicine we talk about addiction and the 12 steps to dealing with fighting alcoholism or other addictions. The first step is denial. You get past the denial, and I think we as Muslims need an intervention. We need to understand that while I've never met a Muslim that, you're right, I've never met a Muslim that condones terrorism, but I've met many that basically are soft on the ideas that separate our youth away from America and don't own the fact that there are ideas that radicalize our community towards that direction of then putting them into the hands of radicals like Al-Qaeda and others.
Jim in Cable is with us now. Hi, Jim.
Good morning. Yes, Socrates once said the most important element in a civil democratic society is who is teaching our children and what are they teaching them. And I think that applies to Muslims as well as Christians, that somewhere along the way we have to understand how this all comes about, and I think that's very important.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. We have a Muslim Liberty Project at the American Islamic Forum in which we teach Muslims that the only way, we don't, de-radicalization, where you take a radical who starts to hate America and wants to basically go to the battlefield, that's very difficult. But counter-radicalization, because what we're fighting is what I call Islamo-patriotism. The ISIS folks believe that the Islamic State is something they want to die for. I think the only way to inoculate our consciousness against that is to teach our youth to want to die for America. That the only nation state they'd ever want to die for would be America or Western states that are free, or in the Middle East. We talk to Egyptians or Syrians. Those Syrians I think that we should be defending are those who want to die for freedom, not for jihad. Because if it's for jihad, it's ultimately an Islamic state that's a theocracy. So there's that battle going on within the House of Islam. And I think, we, for example, have our Muslim Liberty Project youth listen to or read a debate that happened between James Madison and George Mason. George Mason wanted to put the word Christian into the founding documents, so I would say he was sort of like a Christianist, versus James Madison and Jefferson, who said, no, we need to leave God out of it, Christianity out of it, that we are a nation under God, because we don't want to debate which form of Christianity. This is exactly the debate Muslims need to have, and why you get the most religious freedom in a society that separates church and state, or in our community, mosque and state.
Next we go to Haroon in Madison. Good morning.
Huh?
Yes, you're on the air.
Good morning.
Good morning. Go ahead.
Well, so being a Muslim in America is kind of ordinary. Like, It's more of, but some people are like stare at you in a weird way, makes you want to go inside your house. But I just ignore them and I just keep walking. No, not many people know I'm Muslim, but I only tell my closest friends. Like right now, I'm in school and it's a Muslim school, so they technically all know I'm Muslim.
So, Harun, how old are you?
10.
10. My goodness, I didn't realize that we had a young person calling in. But most people don't know you're Muslim, so they don't say anything. But if they do, is there ever any problem?
Someone said that one time when I was in an airport. I was going on a Muslim holiday. I was wearing traditional Muslim clothes. Someone asked me a strange question, like, what do you have in your bag? Can you open your bag? And I'm like, no, how would I? And then I overheard them talking like, I think that kid's a jihadi or something.
Oh, so that a 10-year-old shouldn't have to be answering that kind of question, Zuhdi Jasser, or what?
You're right. I have 3 kids. My kids are 13. One other one is 11, your age, and a little one who's 7. And we have been having these conversations. They do get confronted sometimes with comments, sometimes not directed to them, but said generally, and some of their friends may not realize they're Muslim. My mom wears the hijab, and many of our family members wear a hijab that makes it obvious that they're Muslim. And I think as America is going through this, God tests us in many different ways, and God is testing America and is testing the world right now with this evil that is ISIS and that does things in the name of Islam. And I think in this test, in this challenge for all of us, is to stand strong for what we believe and try to not succumb to the how easy it is sometimes to say that we're a victim, but rather to stand proud of who we are, our country, our faith, and say that, we're going to do whatever we can to fix the problem and be part of the solution. Yeah.
Well, how do you be a part of the solution or respond to things like kids being tormented or bullied in schools, or I think there was a suspected arson at a mosque in the LA area a couple of days ago. I mean, this is not the way we should be dealing with this.
Oh, absolutely not. And I think ultimately the school system and wherever that happens, the community needs to make strong statements that Muslims are part of our fabric and that there will be no tolerance at all for any type of bigotry or acts that destroy property or put people at risk, because that will unravel who we are as Americans. And there's the reason our religious freedom is our first freedom is because it is central to the American identity. And we have to hold on to that and not let radicals from abroad change who we are as Americans. But I think, secondly, is to begin programs of education. I think there is nothing more comforting to our communities. And it's interesting, in our Muslim reform movement, we added a line. We said our ummah means faith community among Muslims or Islam. One of the main things we want to reform is change the concept of ummah from being just about Muslims to being about all humanity. So we believe our ummah is not only Muslims anymore, but it's all humanity. And we have to reform that, because right now ummah means Islamic State. So as long as the Islamic State exists, you are going to then inspire jihad and other aspects. So, I think ultimately, if we can, as Muslims believe and as Americans believe, that our community is all faith communities or people who have no faith, ultimately that's what keeps us strong, and we have to have programs to educate Americans about that. And also, if you have a strategic approach from a national security perspective, you can allay fears in every American by telling them, listen, the only solution you're talking about might be only 1% in America, but this is a faith practiced by 1.6 billion or 23% of the world's population. So unless we engage reformers and our allies within, this is not going to end well.
We are talking about the anti-Muslim rhetoric and backlash since the recent terror attacks in Paris and in San Bernardino, California. And we're welcoming your thoughts, your observations, your questions for our guest, Zuhdi Jasser, who is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. 1-800-642-1234, or send an email to talk@wpr.org. I'm Joy Cardin. This is the Ideas Network. You're listening to the Ideas Network of Wisconsin Public Radio. I'm Joy Cardin. We are talking with Zuhdi Jasser, who is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He serves as vice chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and he is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. He is a physician in private practice in Phoenix, Arizona, but he grew up in Neenah, Wisconsin, and we've talked to him before about issues of being Muslim in America, and we are talking with him about the anti-Muslim rhetoric that has cropped up in recent days and weeks following especially the San Bernardino terrorist attack. Back to the phones as we have full lines. Gary in Merrill is with us. Hi, Gary.
Yes, hi. Well, going back to the boy that called with his problems at an airport, if he was a Christian boy, Libya, Egypt, Syria, he would have been murdered. So that's the difference between here and there. The other thing I would bring up is all of these people that have committed these killings in the United States, the couple in California, the brothers in Mass, Tennessee, and Texas, they're born-again Muslim. They were secular Arabs. They joined a mosque here in the United States, and then they committed their crimes. How can you explain that?
So how does this radicalization happen, Zuhdi Jasser?
Yeah, I want to answer the first thing, too, really quick. I think it's important. Yesterday Mr. Trump tried to beat his chest a little bit and said, they kill us, so why can't we kill them, and justifying. And I'm not saying that this is what you're saying, sir, but I think it's important that we understand that this rhetoric, and as much as it may feel good and cathartic to hear our political leaders give us a bit more force and from our commander-in-chief about what they're going to do, to basically announce that you want to kill families of terrorists is not smart. Not only is it not smart, it's un-American. And they talked about Geneva Convention and other things, obviously, which that violates. But it also changes who we are. I joined the Navy and served 11 years because I believed our military was the most moral force for good on the planet. And I took care of and treated our soldiers who put themselves at risk because they never wanted to lose any life unnecessarily. So I think it's important that we understand who we are and not sort of do the moral equivalency of what they do over there versus what we would do as Americans who are moral. I think as far as radicalization is concerned, the radicalization issue is you're right. It starts early. It starts with a separatism. If you look in Belgium, these militants that were in neighborhoods in which they may have immigrated their families to Belgium, but they didn't internalize the philosophy of a secular state that treats everybody equally, and which the law is based in reason and common law rather than based in Sharia or the domination of clerics. So this is why it's important. We took our Muslim Reform Movement declaration and we taped it on the doors after our press conference that I'd ask all of you to see. Go to our MuslimReformMovement.org website and look at the video at our Facebook page where we taped it on the doors of the Saudi mosque, the Saudi government's mosque on Mass Avenue in Washington, D.C. Our movement's going to take it to every mosque we can and ask the Muslim community to weigh in about what they feel about these values that I mentioned earlier. And, if they are with us, that these are the values that Islam can be compatible with, then they're not part of the radicalization problem. If they're not with us and they say, well, we accept the laws of America, but in Islam, men and women cannot be equal, the state has to be run by Sharia, Sharia, Christians get their rights from Islam, not from God, et cetera, et cetera. These apologetics are part of the radicalization separatism that is the pathway towards radicalization. So we have to acknowledge that there are gateway drugs towards the militancy that is the much bigger problem, and treat those gateway drugs.
Yeah, back to Donald Trump and his call to go after family members of terrorists. In the debate last night, he defended that call, saying that he would be very firm with them, and expressed confidence that he thinks that family members know that what the terrorists are up to. He mentioned that he thought that the mother of the man involved in San Bernardino's attack saw pipe bombs lying around and said or did nothing. He said that while the terrorists may not care much about their own lives, they care about the lives of their families. What do you say about that? How does that position sit with you?
Listen, there's no doubt in our legal system we have differences between first-degree, second-degree murder, accomplices to murder, etc. So nobody's apologizing or excusing the family members that sort of see things happening and realize that this is not just a regular business operation, that their brothers or their uncles are participating in an evil operation. I'm not excusing that. And there's no doubt that presidents have to make difficult decisions, and sometimes if we know that there is a large terrorist operation happening and they have an ability to target that, like when we raided bin Laden, our SEALs went in there, they did it as a raid, not as a bomb, because they didn't want to lose life unnecessarily. Now, were there some family members that lost their lives? Likely, but that's A, part of war, but B, that doesn't mean we then carpet bomb families and that may be harboring terrorists. Why? Not only because of the Geneva Convention, it is immoral. I can tell you that the reason I served in the U.S. Navy was our families escaped Syria. The reason ISIS is thriving is because of the evil nature of the Syrian military. The Syrian military targets with barrel bombs, with chemical weapons, large neighborhoods in the name of fighting terrorism. So if you want to feed into the ISIS narrative that we are no different than the Assad regimes of the world, then we start to use this type of language when we talk about defeating terrorists. And all that does is actually fuel their movements and say that, you know what, we're being fought by a force as corrupt as you guys think we are, and thus we lose the battle of ideas.
Yeah. What about when President Obama says that the Muslim community needs to do more to root out the extremism? I think he's saying more than just condemning a terrorist attack, but to do more within the community.
I can't tell you how great it was to hear him say that. We've been asking him to say that for years. And I think I would like to see him go further, to say that, yes, rooting it out into the theology. When he says ISIS is not Islamic, I wish he said the same thing about Saudi Arabia or the Islamic Republic of Iran. And these are large theocracies that do things in the name of Islam that are the boot camps for the ISISes of the world. So, yes, our Islamic community needs, and I hope our president and both parties can embrace our bipartisan Muslim reform movement as being an example of Muslims that are working to root it out, and that we don't just focus on the violent part when they say they want to do things with weapons and targeting militants, but actually with the countering of ideas.
Leo in Charlottesville, Virginia is with us. Hi, Leo.
Hi there. I'm just calling because I have to say I really do love the work that Dr. Jasser is doing, and there's somebody who's lived around the world and came to the U.S. as a migrant and is enlisting in the military. I think it's great. But at the same time, I have to say that some of the terminology that Dr. Jasser uses I find concerning, particularly when he talks about being an American first and a Muslim second, when both of those ideas do not contradict each other. There's no conflicting idea, because truthfully, I would not be a Muslim if it was tyrannical and oppressive. And similarly, I would not have chosen to become an American if I thought that being an American is tyrannical and oppressive either. So does it hurt the process when you say things like that?
That's a great question. And, my mother asked me the same thing when we started our process, and I've been saying this since 2003 when we formed the IFD. And my response was, when I served in the military, our Marines talk about God, country, family, core. God comes first. I've never said that God does not come first. The issue is your Muslim identity. In order for us to defeat radical Islam, we have to say the era of having an army that identifies itself as a Muslim army is done. That only can happen if you end the idea of the Islamic State. So yes, I'm an American first and Muslim second, because Muslim is a community a community concept, not one related to the more moral guidance of God, which is definitely first. So I think we have to separate. This is why I was talking before about Ummah being the entire community and not just Muslims, but our Ummah is our entire country, our entire planet. So I think these concepts are very important. I am not rejecting my Muslim identity. And I would ask you to read a book by Elijah Izbegovich called Islam Between East and West. And he said, he was never more Muslim than when he was in solitary confinement under Tito for 15 years in Yugoslavia. But he said, nobody could ever take away God from him. But what made him have human rights and be able to write music and poetry was his government that gave him freedom. And when that went away, that's why he was Bosnian first, and Muslim second. So yes, he believes in God, but God could never be taken away from him. But ultimately, his Muslim identity was no longer necessary other than as a faith community, yes, in our mosques and educational system, etc. We're not going to abandon that, but our allegiance has to be first to the country that gives us freedom.
Let's go to Sarah in Lake Zurich, Illinois.
Thanks.
Hi.
Thanks. I want to tell you, the guest, that the only thing, most of what I know about Islam is from Risa Aslan's book, No God But God, and I just want to ask you, when you're talking about reform, are you basing that on trying to reinterpret what's in the Quran, what Muhammad said, or are you going to look at what it's called, the Hadith, or like laws that they think Muhammad might have supported, but they don't really know?
Oh boy, we only have a little more than a minute to go, Dr. Jasser.
Yeah, all I would tell you is that our Muslim reform movement has principles that we want, sort of like going to the moon. We know that we want to go there. How we get there, it's going to include all of the above. Relooking at hadith, most of which were corrupted, by the way. Not changing any of the Arabic script, which we believe is from God and inalterable, but the interpretation of the Quran. And the key is separating mosque and state so that imams can be in the mosques, in universities, but keep the clerics out of government so that we can have laboratories to do this deep, long, generational work and create a new school of thought of Sharia law, or a new madhab, as it's called, that abandons the ones that are still stuck in the 13th century.
Yeah, and we'll leave it there because we are out of time. Thank you so much for being with us.
Anytime. Thank you.
Zuhdi Jasser, founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, author of A Battle to Save the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. He also serves as vice chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. He is originally, or at least grew up in Neenah, in the Fox Valley area, and he is now a physician in private practice in Phoenix, Arizona. Thanks to Marika Suval for producing this program. Thanks to Bill Martins for on-air direction, and to Elizabeth Delaquest for on-air production. Thank you for listening. I hope you stay tuned. Much more to come. Tomorrow at this time, we are going to preview the new Star Wars film that opens this weekend in theaters across the country. We'll talk about Star Wars Mania coming up tomorrow at this time. I'm Joy Cardin. This is the Ideas Network.